There was a strange unease in the air, as if an unseen secret was on the verge of breaking free. Behind the golden doors of the ancient manor lay a truth that would not only unmask the killer, but shake the very foundation of the entire village. When Miss Eleanor looked out of her window that night, she saw a shadow flickering in the moonlight, a face that was supposed to be dead, or perhaps only pretending to be. It was a quiet morning in St. Mary Mead, but beneath that quiet lay something unsettled. The sun shone just enough to cast long, creeping shadows, but not enough to break the eerie stillness that hung over the village. The cobblestone streets, the neatly tucked houses, the hedgerows framing each path, it all looked as if it had been carefully arranged, like an old quilt, where every fold concealed something beneath it. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a lingering reminder that beneath the polished surface of life, something was always shifting, always waiting to be uncovered. Miss Jane Marple moved through the lanes, her pace unhurried, her worn shoes tapping lightly against the stone. In her hands, knitting needles clicked in a steady rhythm, but her true craft was far more intricate than mere thread and wool. She had an ear for the murmurs of the village, for the whispers that passed unnoticed to others. Every greeting she received, a polite, "Good morning, Miss Marple," or a knowing nod, was accompanied by a flicker of something unsaid, something restrained. St. Mary Mead was a village where secrets were kept, but never truly safe. She passed the bakery, where Mrs. Smithers prattled endlessly about her roses, though everyone knew they were hardly worth mentioning. The real curiosity was her bedridden husband, whose presence she barely seemed to acknowledge, except on Sundays when she never left his side. Then there was Miss Audrey Hills, walking briskly, her face flushed, her nervous eyes darting about. She had spent years as a companion to Lady Constance Fairchild, but something about her was off. Perhaps it was the way her hand always hovered near the clasp of her handbag, as if she were ready to hide something at the first sign of trouble. The gossip that filled the air was the same as always: who had purchased which property, whose daughter had fallen in with the wrong company. But there was something else today, a shift in the wind, a tremor in the stillness. By the time Miss Marple reached the local inn, she could sense it fully. The usual hum of quiet conversation had been replaced by hurried whispers and tense glances. Something had happened. The postman had arrived later than usual, the village constable had been seen rushing through the square, and then came the news: the Silver Slope Express, a luxurious train carrying the rich and influential, had derailed not far from St. Mary Mead. A faulty switch, they said. The details were scarce, but the unease it brought was enough to stir the village from its usual complacency. Passengers had begun arriving at the inn, their faces pale, their eyes shadowed with something more than just shock. This was not the kind of disruption St. Mary Mead was used to. Lady Constance Fairchild stood stiffly, surveying the modest accommodations with disdain, as though unwilling to accept her circumstances. Mr. Alfred Bancroft, his tailored suit still perfectly pressed, tried too hard to appear composed while stealing glances at the others. Rachel Green clutched a small urn of her late husband's ashes, as if afraid it might slip from her grasp. Colonel Henry Montague stood by the doorway, shoulders squared, chin raised, as if sheer willpower could restore order to chaos. And then there was Miss Audrey Hills, uneasy, restless, her fingers trembling slightly as she kept glancing toward the window. Miss Marple did not need to ask questions. She could see it in the way they moved, in the careful way they avoided each other's eyes, in the subtle tension that lingered in the air. This was not just an accident. These were not simply survivors. There was something else at play here, something no one was willing to say out loud. She paused for a moment, observing, absorbing. Then, with a small nod to herself, she continued her walk, her steps slow but deliberate. She was never one to intrude where she wasn't wanted, but she knew with certainty that secrets never stayed buried for long, and when there were too many questions, The answers were never far behind. Tension often led to something far deadlier than a mere train derailment. Miss Marple had seen it before, recognized the scent of fear when it hung too thick in the air, clinging to people like damp fog. Inside the inn, the stranded passengers were already being served tea, though not a single cup was lifted to the lips, their hands too preoccupied with gripping armrests, or pressing against folded napkins in nervous futile attempts at composure. The room itself seemed to conspire against them, thick velvet drapes suffocating the last trace of natural light, a roaring fire that gave no warmth, but instead cast flickering, distorted shadows against the dark wooden walls. The furniture, too large and too elaborate, sat in judgment over its occupants, as if silently mocking their discomfort. Mary Mead had never been a kind host to strangers. It had a way of unearthing the weaknesses they sought to hide, a way of drawing secrets into the open like a wound festering just beneath the skin. The village thrived on whispers, on the unspoken knowledge that everything, no matter how well concealed, had a way of surfacing. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the innkeeper greeted, approaching with an uneasy smile. He was a broad man with shoulders too heavy for the thin fabric of his vest, his fingers twitching against the tray he carried. The presence of wealth unsettled him, the arrival of the powerful always did. "Morning," Miss Marple replied, her gaze sweeping across the room, reading the silent language of restless hands, darting eyes, the slight tremble in an otherwise steady voice. "Quite the turn of events, isn't it?" The innkeeper let out a short humorless chuckle. "A real mess if you ask me. But it's not the derailment that's keeping them on edge, it's something else entirely." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, a knowing glimmer in her eyes. "Discomfort indeed," she murmured. "More likely the kind that comes from carrying something one cannot afford to lose." The innkeeper shifted his weight, avoiding her gaze. "Not my place to say," he muttered. But she had already turned her attention back to the arrivals. The games had already begun, though not all the players seemed aware of the rules. Lady Constance Fairchild sat at the farthest end of the room, spine rigid against the elaborate upholstery of her chair, her gloved fingers clutching a delicate handkerchief, twisting the fabric in slow, controlled movements. She wore lavender, a color of half-mourning, of subtle declarations unspoken, but her expression was anything but serene. Across from her, Mr. Alfred Bancroft sat with calculated ease, his fingers idly tapping against the armrest, but his eyes, sharp assessing, gave him away. A practiced man, one who measured his words like a merchant weighed gold. Nearby, Miss Audrey Hills stood apart, her posture too stiff, her gaze flickering toward the window as though expecting something, or someone, to appear from the mist beyond. Her hands clutched at the clasp of her handbag, a gesture too rehearsed, too telling. There was something inside, something she feared losing, or something she feared being found. Miss Marple took in these details as one takes in the first few lines of a novel, already knowing how the story would unfold, already sensing the threads of deception twisting together. She lingered for a moment longer, long enough to see the silent glances exchanged, the subtle betrayals hidden in the smallest of movements. Then, with a final nod to herself, she stepped away, unhurried, letting the wheels of the mystery turn at their own inevitable pace. The truth never came too soon, but it always came, and Miss Marple would be there when it did. The room was thick with an unspoken weight, the kind that settled into the air like dust in a forgotten house, visible only when the light hit just right. Audrey Hills sat at the edge of it all, her presence so carefully muted that she might as well have been part of the shadows clinging to the corners. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, and though her lips parted slightly, no sound came forth. She had not spoken since her arrival, not even when addressed, as if words themselves were a dangerous thing. Across from her, Lady Helena Warwick was anything but silent. "Mrs. Harrington, you'll excuse me if your troubles do not take precedence over mine," she announced. her voice slicing through the uneasy quiet with the precision of a blade. The room seemed to shrink around her, every pair of eyes unwillingly drawn toward the force of her presence. There was something gravitational about her, something that demanded attention. Mrs. Eloise Harrington barely lifted her gaze. She was clutching a small wooden box in her lap, a delicate thing with a worn gilded clasp, the kind of trinket that seemed too fragile to have survived long years of handling. Her hands curled protectively around it, her thin fingers pressing against its surface, as if it held together more than just its contents. "It's not as terrible as all that," she murmured, but even she did not sound convinced. Miss Eleanor March, who had been sitting with her knitting untouched in her lap, observed in silence, though her mind was already pulling at the loose threads of the scene before her. There was something sharp in the air, something brittle about the way these people interacted. She had lived long enough in the village to know that no one ever truly left it behind. Those who passed through carried something away, but they always left something of themselves behind as well. Some stains never washed out. Colonel Frederick Lowell sat rigidly in his chair, his military uniform still speckled with the dust of travel. Though his posture was impeccable, there was something else lurking beneath it, something too controlled. Even a man who had spent a lifetime in war knew when he was not welcome. "I would like to think we are all in this together," he said, his voice level, his gaze sweeping the room with a measuring quality. "But I trust we will be moving on soon. The sooner we leave this wretched place, the better." Miss March allowed herself the faintest smile. "Of course, Colonel," she said, her voice light, almost amused, "but not everything moves at the pace we prefer. A well-brewed tea takes time, does it not?" The Colonel regarded her carefully, his expression unreadable. "I prefer mine without the weight. Patience is an acquired taste," she mused, turning her attention to Audrey, whose shoulders had tightened at the conversation. "Are you quite all right, Miss Hills?" Her tone was gentle, inviting rather than prying, and yet the question seemed to rattle Audrey. She looked up too quickly, her breath catching for just a second before she forced a weak, hollow smile. "Oh yes, just fine, thank you." A lie, of course, but not a polite one, a desperate one. Miss March knew the difference. "It has been quite the journey," she said, watching her closely. "I imagine you must be rather fatigued. And the box you carry for Mrs. Harrington, it must weigh on you." Audrey's gaze flickered toward the object in Mrs. Harrington's lap, just for a moment, but the way her fingers tensed at her side gave her away. She did not answer, she did not need to. Lady Helena exhaled sharply, brushing imaginary dust from the sleeves of her traveling coat. "This entire situation is intolerable," she declared, her tone clipped, her composure beginning to crack. "I shall speak to the authorities at once. This ridiculous delay has gone on long enough." "I'm sure it has," Miss March replied, her voice mild, "but as I said, Colonel," she turned her gaze back to Lowell, who was watching her with the quiet calculation of a man deciding whether to call a bluff. "Some things cannot be rushed." The innkeeper, who had been lingering at the edge of the room like a man trying not to be noticed, took an uncertain step forward. His expression was strained, and when he spoke there was the distinct air of someone delivering news he knew would not be received well. "Apologies, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice hesitant. "I've just received word from the authorities. It appears we may be staying a while longer. The train's wreckage is proving more difficult to clear than expected." The reactions were immediate. Some stiffened, others deflated with quiet resignation. Lady Helena's lips pressed into a thin line. Colonel Lowell's fingers curled against the arm of his chair. Bancroft, who had been silent until now, exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable, but Miss March noted the briefest flicker of something in his eyes, something cautious, something measured. He was hiding something. But then again, weren't they all? Mrs. Harrington's grip on the wooden box tightened, her knuckles standing out against her pale skin. Miss March did not miss that, either. There was something here, something simmering just beneath the surface, a secret coiled tight, like a spring wound too far. She settled back into her chair, the weight of the moment settling around her like a thick fog. The waiting was nearly over, the stew was about to boil over, and when it did, she would be watching. The inn was filled with the quiet weight of waiting, the kind that settled in the air like dust, disturbed by unseen hands. Outside, the night lay heavy over the village of Blackwood Hollow, a place where the past clung to its residents like a shadow they could never quite outrun. The winding streets had emptied, save for the occasional flicker of movement beyond shuttered windows, whispers of life that never quite made themselves known. Inside the inn, the fire burned low, its embers casting restless shapes along the wooden walls. The guests, each an island of their own unease, had settled into their corners, their faces masks of indifference, but their eyes told a different story. Miss Eleanor Graves, perched in her usual chair by the hearth, let her fingers drift over the cool, untouched surface of her teacup. She had been silent since supper, watching, listening. A detective did not need to pry when people were so eager to betray themselves. Across the room, Lady Camilla Whitmore sat stiff-backed, her gloved fingers gripping the armrests of the worn parlor chair, as though it were the only thing tethering her to this reality. She had spoken little since their arrival, her distaste for the accommodations worn plainly on her face, but Miss Graves knew well enough that a person's silence was often more revealing than their words. Beside her, Mr. Nathaniel Beckwith nursed a glass of brandy, his dark eyes flitting between the door and the clock on the mantel as if counting down the minutes to some inevitable confrontation. And then there was Evelyn Marsh, the girl with too much caution in her movements, the kind of hesitation that made a person easy to overlook. She sat near the window, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She had flinched when the clock had struck 11, and Miss Graves had not missed the way her gaze had darted toward the staircase. Somewhere above them, the floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen footsteps. The sound was soft but deliberate. A shiver of awareness passed through the room, an unspoken question threading itself between them. Who else was awake at this hour? Beckwith shifted in his seat, his mouth twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Strange night, isn't it?" he murmured, though his voice carried enough weight to break the brittle silence. "Too quiet," Lady Whitmore exhaled sharply. "I don't see what's so strange about it. This whole place is an inconvenience, nothing more." Her words were clipped, but Miss Graves noticed how she too glanced toward the ceiling, just for a second. "That depends," Graves said softly, setting her teacup down with an intentional clink. "Sometimes quiet is just the prelude to something much louder." The innkeeper, a gaunt man with a nervous air, entered then, carrying a tray with a single cup of tea. His steps faltered when he realized all eyes were on him, his fingers tightening around the handle of the tray. "A message arrived earlier," he stammered, shifting uncomfortably. "The authorities say there's been an issue with the roads. You'll all be staying another night." A ripple of unease spread through the room. Beckwith muttered a curse under his breath. Lady Whitmore shot to her feet, the scrape of her chair loud in the hush. "That's ridiculous." "What kind of issue?" "A carriage overturned. Some debris blocking the main road," the innkeeper said, though the way he refused to meet anyone's eyes suggested there was more to the story. "They'll clear it by morning." Miss Graves watched the room shift under the weight of that revelation. No one spoke, but in that charged silence, she could almost hear the thoughts pressing against the edges of their carefully composed exteriors. They were not strangers, not really. No, they were pieces of the same unfinished story, and soon enough, the next chapter would begin. The first rays of dawn barely kissed the frost-laced windows of Black Hollow Inn, when the maid, balancing a tray of morning tea, hesitated at the end of the dimly lit hallway. A peculiar stillness wrapped itself around the walls, thick and unnatural, as if the house itself was waiting, listening. She had been up since before sunrise, moving through the creaking corridors, delivering tea to those guests who had managed to find sleep. But something about room 6 gave her pause. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way the door stood ajar, not enough to be considered open, but not closed enough to be normal. As she stepped closer, she caught the faintest scent lingering in the cold air, something bitter, something wrong. A shiver crawled up her spine as she lifted her trembling fingers to the door and pushed. The soft glow of dawn spilled into the room, illuminating a scene so unnervingly still that for a moment she thought she had stumbled upon a perfectly staged tableau rather than reality. Miss Evelyn Harcourt, poised and untouchable in life, now lay upon the bed, her body draped across the sheets as if frozen mid-thought. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared unseeing at the ceiling, her lips parted ever so slightly as though she had been about to speak, perhaps to issue her final breath, perhaps to reveal a secret that had died on her tongue. The tray slipped from the maid's grasp, porcelain shattering against the wooden floor, the sharp sound slicing through the oppressive silence like a scream. Downstairs in the parlor, the sound was enough to break the uneasy peace that had settled over the inn like a thick fog. Chairs scraped against the floor, hushed voices turned frantic, and within moments, the inn's uneasy occupants had gathered in the dimly lit hallway. Faces emerged from behind half-open doors, pale and wary, some feigning surprise, others wearing expressions that suggested they had simply been waiting for the inevitable. Langley, ever composed, adjusted his cufflinks with an air of forced nonchalance, while Miss Claire Withers clutched her shawl so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Dr. Forsyth, his face damp with an uneasy sweat, dabbed at his brow with a trembling handkerchief. The innkeeper himself hovered near the stairwell, his face drained of color, his fingers twisting nervously at his apron, as though trying to wring the tension from his own bones. No one dared to be the first to speak. The air was heavy with unspoken questions, unvoiced fears. At the far end of the hallway, seated in an antique armchair, Mrs. Edith Winslow set her knitting aside. She had been expecting this. It had been inevitable from the moment the guests arrived, their conversations measured, their glances too quick to be casual. The inn had become a pressure cooker of secrets, and now with the discovery of Miss Harcourt's body, the first crack had formed. She rose with deliberate slowness, her gaze sharp and unhurried as she surveyed the gathered figures. The moment she stepped into the doorway, a hush fell over the room. Her presence commanded attention, not because she was loud, but because she had the unnerving ability to see what others overlooked. Mrs. Winslow entered the room with practiced ease, her eyes grazing over the details with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing. The teacup sat untouched on the nightstand, the liquid inside still warm enough to suggest the passing of death was not long ago. The window stood slightly open, the curtains shifting ever so slightly with the breeze, though the winter air outside was bitter enough that no one in their right mind would have left it ajar. And there on the writing desk lay a single sheet of paper, the ink still dark and fresh. She stepped closer, her fingers barely grazing the surface, as her eyes settled on the words scrawled in rushed, uneven strokes. "I know," she exhaled slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Know what?" The question didn't just hang in the air, it wrapped around the walls, settled into the cracks of the wooden floors, filled the gaps between every uneasy breath taken in that room. The others shifted restlessly, their gazes flickering from the lifeless form on the bed to the note on the desk, as if afraid that the truth might be staring back at them. From the hallway, the maid let out a strangled whisper. "She was fine last night." She was, her voice faltered, unable to complete the thought. Fine, such a fragile word, so easily broken. Mrs. Winslow turned, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the gathered guests, each one wearing a mask of carefully controlled emotion. Some were fearful, some were curious, but all of them, every last one, were hiding something. The death of Evelyn Harcourt was not an accident, and it was not the first move in this game. It was simply a response to something that had already begun. The morning light strained against the heavy curtains of Ashford Manor as Miss Lillian Hargrove placed the crumpled will on the mahogany writing desk with a measured sigh, her fingers lingering over the ink as if tracing the urgency of the hand that had written it. "A woman's fortune," she murmured, her sharp eyes glinting beneath the brim of her modest hat. "Always a convenient thing to fight over." She stood, her gaze sweeping across the dimly lit chamber, absorbing every inconsistency in the delicate balance between order and chaos. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and something sharper beneath it, something metallic, something wrong. The body of Lady Evelyn Ashford lay eerily undisturbed upon the chaise, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes half-lidded as if contemplating the very betrayal that had stolen her final breath. The silence in the room was unnerving, pressing against the walls like an invisible force waiting to be acknowledged. Behind her, the housekeeper and the innkeeper lingered near the threshold, their hands clenched at their sides, their presence both expectant and fearful. "I suspect," Miss Hargrove said, her voice as soft as it was cutting, "that Lady Ashford did not die by accident." The innkeeper's face turned ashen, his throat working in vain to form a response, his wide eyes shifting toward the housekeeper as if pleading for support. "Did anyone else come in here last night?" she inquired, her voice edged with quiet authority, her gaze sharp enough to carve through falsehoods. "No, Miss Hargrove," the innkeeper stammered, his voice thin. "The door was locked. It was locked, I swear it." He turned desperately to the housekeeper, who nodded with a quick, nervous bob of her head. "Yes, miss, it was locked. I checked myself." "I did hear her voice, though." Miss Hargrove lifted an eyebrow. "Once," she interjected, sensing the hesitation before it even surfaced. "And what did she say?" The housekeeper's lips parted, then pressed together again, as though struggling against some invisible force that held her secrets in place. "She was arguing with someone," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "just before I heard the door close, but I couldn't make out the words." Miss Hargrove turned back toward the body, her eyes narrowing as if the conversation itself had left an imprint on the furniture, the walls, the air itself. "Arguing," she repeated, her tone thoughtful, her gaze flicking to the slender crack beneath the doorframe, where a faint, near-invisible smudge of red lay nestled in the grooves of the polished floor. And who was she arguing with? The housekeeper hesitated. "I don't know, miss," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I only caught pieces." And then she called for tea. It was strange, she sounded upset at first, but then just before the door closed she sounded calm again, as if nothing had happened. Miss Hargrove turned the words over in her mind, studying their weight. "Calm," she mused, pacing to the edge of the room. "That is interesting." She glanced at the window, slightly ajar despite the bitter cold outside. A trail of frost curled along the sill, an invitation left unanswered. Who else had access to this room? She asked, not looking away from the window's warped glass, where the distorted reflections of the housekeeper and innkeeper wavered like ghosts. The innkeeper hesitated. "Everyone, miss," he admitted. "It's an inn, people come and go. But Lady Ashford, she kept to herself last night." Miss Hargrove raised a hand, cutting him off. She had heard enough. "You may leave now," she said, simply. Relief flooded the innkeeper's features as he all but fled the room. The housekeeper lingered a moment longer, her hands twisting in her apron, before she too disappeared into the corridor, leaving Miss Hargrove alone with the dead and their silent confessions. She turned back toward the body. The sharp scent of almonds lingered in the air, a scent that should not have been there at all. Cyanide, most likely, a well-planned thing. But murder was never just a question of method, it was a question of motive, and Miss Hargrove was only interested in the truth that lurked beneath polished alibis and empty reassurances. She reached for the unfinished will once more, her fingers grazing the jagged edge where the paper had been torn. A slow smile curved her lips, though it did not touch her eyes. The will had been changed, but not completed, which meant someone had something to lose, something worth killing for. Outside, the sun clawed its way through the dense clouds, casting long jagged shadows over the village of Whitmore. It was the kind of morning that deceived with its serenity, a thin veneer stretched over the unease brewing beneath the surface. The discovery of Lady Ashford's body had sent ripples through the inn, but Miss Hargrove knew better. This was not just a ripple, this was the first crack in the dam, and once the dam broke, there would be no turning back. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Inspector Harrington had arrived. Broad-shouldered, thick-browed, his face was unreadable as he entered, the scent of damp wool clinging to his coat. He was the kind of man who had long since learned that the world was neither fair nor just, but merely a stage upon which the same tragedies played out in different costumes. He met Miss Hargrove's gaze with a knowing look. "Morning, Miss Hargrove," he greeted, his voice gravelly. "Let's not waste time, you already know how these things go." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Hargrove replied, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. "I assume you've seen the body." He exhaled through his nose, rubbing his jaw. "I've seen it." His lips pressed into a hard line. "Poison, no doubt." Miss Hargrove folded her hands in front of her, her gaze settling on the torn will once more. "No doubt," she echoed, her mind already a step ahead. The question was not whether Lady Ashford had been murdered. The question was why, and more importantly, who had the most to gain. A storm raged outside, rain hammering against the cobbled streets, as Miss Eleanor Graves folded her small umbrella and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the Rosewood Inn. The dim glow of a single lantern flickered behind the counter, casting eerie shadows across the room. The innkeeper, Mr. Harrow, stood stiffly, his fingers twitching as he offered a strained smile. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight, Miss Graves," he said, though his voice carried the weight of unease rather than welcome. Eleanor removed her rain-soaked hat with a measured calm, shaking off the droplets with deliberate precision. "You know why I'm here, Mr. Harrow," she said, her tone soft but unwavering, "and I don't believe you're entirely surprised." A brief flicker of fear crossed the innkeeper's face, but he quickly masked it. From the corner of the room, a tall woman draped in a flowing black dress remained unnervingly still. Catherine Elms, a woman known for her quiet composure and a past riddled with whispers of secrets too dark to name. She absently twirled a withered red rose between her fingers, her expression unreadable. "Lady Aldridge was found dead in her room," Eleanor continued, her sharp eyes never leaving Harrow, "and I suspect it was no accident." Harrow swallowed hard, his gaze darting toward Catherine, who merely smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips, as cold as the wind outside. "Strange, isn't it?" Eleanor mused, tilting her head. "I was told she spoke to someone just before she died, but only for a moment." Catherine's smile didn't waver. "Not every voice is meant to be heard," she said softly. Eleanor stepped forward, placing her hat neatly on the table, her senses absorbing every detail, the faint scent of cloves and cinnamon lingering in the air, the slight tremor in Harrow's hands, and the peculiar stillness in Catherine's demeanor. "Tell me, Mr. Harrow," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what was Lady Aldridge most concerned about before she died?" Harrow hesitated before reaching into his apron pocket, pulling out a small, unopened envelope. "I found this in her room," he admitted, his fingers trembling. "It wasn't opened, but I figured you'd want to see it." Eleanor took the envelope, feeling its light weight, yet sensing the heavy significance it carried. She carefully unfolded it, her eyes narrowing as she read the words. "It's a simple note," she murmured, "but what's written here speaks volumes." Catherine took a step forward, her curiosity evident, but Eleanor swiftly closed the paper in her palm. "The question isn't just who killed Lady Aldridge," she said, her voice carrying an edge now, "but rather who benefits the most from her death." Harrow shifted uncomfortably, wiping his hands on his apron, while Catherine took a measured step back, as if recoiling from some unseen force. "I suspect," Eleanor continued, her gaze sweeping the dimly lit room, "that everyone here is carrying a burden of secrets, and when secrets grow too heavy, death is rarely the end, it is merely the beginning." The heavy rain lashed against the old glass panes of Blackwood Manor, a relentless drumming that mirrored the unease settling within its grand yet decaying walls. Inspector Elias Crow stood near the unlit fireplace, his sharp eyes scanning the faces gathered in the dimly lit drawing room. The air was thick with tension, the scent of aged mahogany mixing with the faint, lingering perfume of the deceased, Lady Rosalind Ashford. Lady Rosalind had been found dead in her private study, her lifeless form slumped over an unfinished letter, a single candle flickering beside her, as though still guarding the final secrets she had tried to pen. Poison, the doctor had concluded. But Inspector Crow knew better. Poison was merely a method. The real mystery lay in the why. Seated stiffly in a high-backed chair was Lord Edmund Ashford, her estranged husband, his face carved from stone, betraying nothing but an icy detachment. Beside him stood Vivienne Holloway, Lady Rosalind's devoted companion, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Across the room by the rain-streaked window stood Mr. Alistair Vane, a trusted solicitor, a man who had made a career out of secrets, his own and others. And then there was Margaret Maggie, Clark, the housemaid, standing near the door, her anxious gaze darting between them, as if she were listening to ghosts. Crow tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, his voice calm but edged with quiet authority. Lady Rosalind was writing a letter before she died. A letter addressed to the authorities. It was never sent. Vivienne flinched, her lips pressing together. What did it say? She asked, though the way she gripped the fabric of her dress suggested she already had an idea. Crow tilted his head slightly. It spoke of betrayal, a hidden truth that had festered for years. She feared for her life. The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Ashford remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on the shadows dancing along the wall. Mr. Vane cleared his throat, adjusting the cuff of his pristine suit. Surely, Inspector, you don't mean to suggest foul play? I never suggest, Crow interjected smoothly. I deduce. He turned his attention to Maggie, who had been shifting her weight uncomfortably. You were seen outside Lady Rosalind's door last night, weren't you? Maggie's eyes widened. I only went to bring her tea, sir. She wasn't answering, and I thought that something was wrong. Crow finished for her, or that she was still alive. Maggie's breath hitched, and Vivienne let out a soft, involuntary gasp. Crow stood, moving with an unhurried grace, his gaze flicking between them all. The truth always reveals itself in the end. Poison may silence a voice, but it does not erase the echoes of what was left unsaid. Lady Rosalind feared someone among you. The question is, which of you feared her more? The candle beside Lady Rosalind's unfinished letter flickered violently before extinguishing itself, plunging the room into darkness. The storm had settled into a cold, lingering mist over Ravenshade, a village that prided itself on its predictability, until now. The hush of the morning was deceptive, a mere cover for the unease crackling beneath the surface. Inspector Calloway leaned against the heavy oak desk in the dimly lit study of Briarwood Manor, his gaze steady on the people gathered before him. Lady Eleanor Pembroke had been found dead in her drawing room, her teacup overturned, a faint trace of something sinister lacing the porcelain. Poison, the doctor had said, but poison was just a weapon. The real mystery was the motive. Miss Julia Graves, the lady's long-time companion, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers pressing against each other as if to keep from trembling. Across from her, Lord Henry Pembroke, the grieving husband, stood near the fireplace, his silhouette rigid against the low burning embers. His sorrow was carefully measured, his grief oddly distant. Near the door, half hidden in the shadows, was Thomas Finch, the Pembrokes' butler, his expression unreadable, but his stance unnaturally still, as though waiting for something, perhaps waiting for a way out. And then there was Arthur Price, the family solicitor, impeccably dressed, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Calloway cleared his throat, his voice slicing through the thick silence. Lady Eleanor's death wasn't an accident. Someone in this house had a reason to silence her. Julia flinched but said nothing. Lord Pembroke exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Inspector, my wife had many ailments. It's possible, no, Calloway interrupted smoothly. It's not. Her tea was tampered with. The question is by whom? His eyes flickered to Finch. You prepared the tea last night, didn't you? Finch's lips parted, but no sound came. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, sir, but I swear I did nothing to harm her. Calloway tilted his head. Then tell me, why did you leave the kitchen door unlocked? And why were you seen outside after midnight? A ripple of tension spread through the room. Finch swallowed hard. He hesitated, then sighed. I stepped out for air. That's all. Arthur Price, silent until now, spoke up. Inspector, are you accusing a loyal servant without proof? Calloway smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Proof? That's the thing about poison. It's subtle. It hides in the details. He turned to Julia. Miss Graves, you were the last to speak with Lady Eleanor. Did she mention anything unusual? Julia hesitated, her lips trembling. She said she had made a decision, that it was time to set things right. The room tensed. Lord Pembroke's gaze darkened. What decision? Julia's voice was barely above a whisper. She was going to change her will. A sharp intake of breath. Calloway's smile tightened. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where this mystery begins. At that moment, a gust of wind rattled the windows, sending a shiver through the room. Somewhere outside, the church bells tolled, a somber reminder that in Ravenshade, secrets never stayed buried for long. The village of Blackthorn Hollow was never a place for scandal, yet that afternoon, an unnatural weight hung over its cobblestone streets. The marketplace, usually buzzing with idle chatter, had taken on an eerie hush, the sort of silence that carried the weight of something unspoken. Eleanor Whitmore, the ever-watchful proprietor of the apothecary, stood by her window, her fingers absently tracing the glass as she observed the slow-moving figures outside. She had overheard whispers at dawn, mentions of an unlocked door at the Willowmere Inn, of Lady Rosamond Lyle's unfinished letter found upon her desk, of the peculiar scent of almonds clinging to the edges of a teacup. Poison, they said, though no one dared say it too loudly. Not yet. Detective Alistair Harrow had already begun his inquiries, his sharp gaze moving through the village with quiet calculation. The butcher's wife, Mrs. Greaves, had spoken of a man seen near the inn in the dead of night, his silhouette sharp against the mist. The baker's apprentice had recalled the way Miss Judith Holloway, Lady Rosamond's closest confidant, had rushed from the post office that morning, her face pale, her hands shaking as she clutched a sealed envelope to her chest. Even the blacksmith's son, a boy of only 13, had claimed to have seen the heavy drapes of Lady Rosamond's window flutter open just past midnight, though no candle had burned within. But it was at the tea shop, a quaint establishment, nestled at the corner of the square, where the first crack in the illusion of normalcy appeared. Miss Whitmore had seen the package herself, delivered discreetly, its label bearing only the word Bitterleaf. An unusual request, certainly, for Lady Rosamond had never been one for such blends. And yet, only a day before her death, she had sent for it, requesting it be prepared precisely at 8, its infusion steeped longer than usual. A detail so small, and yet so precise, it could not be ignored. The question was no longer whether she had been murdered, it was who had played the hand that ended her life. There was her husband, Charles Lyle, who had more debts than he cared to admit, his demeanor that morning too carefully composed. There was Judith, her loyalty to Rosamond unshaken, but her nervous glances betraying an unspoken fear. There was Elias Blackwell, the enigmatic traveller, who had arrived in Blackthorn Hollow only a fortnight before, his reasons for lingering as murky as the waters of the millpond. And then, of course, there was the matter of the missing page, the final line of Lady Rosamond's letter, torn from its binding and nowhere to be found. The sun dipped lower, and the quiet hum of the village deepened into something more restless. Alistair Harrow moved with purpose now, his steps carrying him toward the inn, where the scent of forgotten teas still clung to the air. He had always known that Blackthorn Hollow held its secrets well, but tonight, the village itself seemed to be holding its breath. Because somewhere, amidst the whispers and the glances, the truth was waiting to be found. And in Blackthorn Hollow, the truth had a way of revealing itself when least expected. The vicarage stood in the hush of the late afternoon, the amber light filtering through lace curtains, casting intricate patterns onto the polished wood floor. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed almost deafening in the silence that stretched between Eleanor Warwick and Mrs. Adeline Forsyth. Eleanor sat with perfect composure, her fingers lightly curled around the delicate china of her teacup, her expression one of quiet contemplation. Across from her, Mrs. Forsyth's hands hovered over her embroidery, the needle momentarily suspended mid-air, as though she had lost track of the pattern she had been so diligently following. It was a small thing, a mere hesitation, but Eleanor had long since learned that the smallest hesitations often revealed the deepest fears. "It's a terrible thing, isn't it?" Mrs. Forsyth murmured, breaking the silence with a voice that was far too carefully measured. To think that someone might have meant her harm. She stirred her tea, though she hadn't taken a sip since Eleanor arrived, the silver spoon clinking against the porcelain in an uneven rhythm. "Mrs. Harrow was just saying the other day, well, I suppose you know how people talk. But surely this isn't something for idle gossip." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, watching the way the light caught the fine lines at the corners of Mrs. Forsyth's eyes, the way her shoulders held just the faintest trace of tension. "People always talk, Adeline," she said softly, taking a sip of her own tea. "The trouble is sometimes what they say isn't nearly as important as what they don't." The moment stretched long and unbroken, and there it was, that flicker of hesitation again, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Eleanor had spent years unraveling the whispers of the village, piecing together what lay beneath the surface. And today the whispers spoke of Miss Lydia Blackwell, a woman whose sudden and unexpected death had sent ripples through the quiet village of Alderwood. Miss Blackwell had not been without her share of enemies. A recent inheritance, an unexpected change to her will, a last-minute appointment with the solicitor. The details were forming a pattern, though the threads were not yet fully woven. A visitor had been seen at the inn on the night of her death, moving swiftly through the dimly lit corridors. A letter, sealed but undelivered, had disappeared without a trace. And then there was the faint lingering scent of bitter almonds, the scent that had clung to her empty teacup. Poison, that was the word, murmured behind closed doors, in the hushed corners of the grocer's shop and the post office. But poison required more than opportunity, it required patience, precision, intent. "You mustn't think too much of it," Mrs. Forsyth said quickly, her spoon clattering slightly against her saucer as she set it down. "A mistake surely, these things happen." Eleanor inclined her head, as though in agreement, though she already saw the tapestry beginning to take shape before her. "Strange, isn't it?" she said lightly, running her finger along the rim of her cup, "that someone should need such a thing now of all times." Mrs. Forsyth hesitated, her gaze flickering, first to the door, then to the window, then back to Eleanor, who merely smiled. "It was Evelyn Harrow, wasn't it?" Eleanor continued, her voice as soft as silk, yet laced with something unmistakably sharp. "She was seen at the chemist's last week, wasn't she? Buying something that seemed peculiar." Mrs. Forsyth's lips parted, as though she might deny it, but the words never came. "Cleaner," Eleanor murmured, as though speaking to herself. "Or so she claimed, but for what I wonder." The silence in the room was thick, nearly suffocating. The embroidery in Mrs. Forsyth's lap lay untouched, her fingers now clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. "You don't think," she started, but Eleanor cut in smoothly. "I'm not sure what I think yet," she said, setting her cup down with a quiet click. "But I do know this: Miss Blackwell had plans. Plans to change her will, and there are those who would have had every reason to stop her before she could do so." Mrs. Forsyth's breath hitched, her eyes wide, her gaze darting to the half-drawn curtains, as though fearing unseen ears. "But it wasn't finalized," she said quickly, as if reassuring herself more than Eleanor. She was still thinking things over. There was talk that her nephew had tried to change her mind. "It's all very muddled, Eleanor. The whole situation is just tangled." Eleanor's fingers stilled against the embroidery in her lap. "It's funny how things can get tangled, isn't it?" she mused, her voice deceptively light. "One thread out of place and the whole thing unravels, especially when there's so much to be gained by pulling the right ones." The silence that followed was longer this time, more weighted. Mrs. Forsyth looked away, her expression pale, her hands shaking ever so slightly. "I don't know anything more," she whispered at last. "You must understand, I only heard bits and pieces." Eleanor rose then, smoothing out the creases in her skirts, her expression unreadable. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice as warm as ever. "I wouldn't want you to say anything you shouldn't." But as she stepped toward the door, she caught sight of Mrs. Forsyth's reflection in the gilded mirror above the mantel, a face drained of color, lips pressed together tightly, as though holding something fragile inside. Eleanor did not turn back. She stepped out into the evening light, the scent of autumn thick in the air, the village stretching before her in golden hues and lengthening shadows. The puzzle was nearly complete now, the final pieces falling into place. A change in inheritance, a bottle of cleaner, a missing letter, a woman who had everything to gain, and perhaps just enough desperation to act. Eleanor had learned long ago that the truth never revealed itself all at once, but even the most tangled threads could be unwound, given time, and time, she knew, had a way of bringing everything into sharp relief. Tonight she would pay Mrs. Evelyn Harrow a visit, and this time she would not leave without answers. Miss Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the dimly lit drawing-room of the Ravenhurst Inn, her sharp eyes sweeping across the room as the hushed murmurs of the gathered villagers ebbed and flowed like the tide. The scent of aged mahogany and dying embers clung to the air, mingling with the faint traces of lavender perfume, an expensive kind, one that Lady Margaret only ever wore on special occasions. But Lady Margaret was dead now, and her secrets were unraveling faster than the gossips of Ashbourne Village could whisper them. The will, the missing heirloom, the letter that had been sent but never arrived. Eleanor did not rush. She had learned that mysteries often revealed themselves in fragments like torn lace stitched back together. Mr. Hargrove, the innkeeper, stood behind the counter, his fingers drumming absently against the wood, a nervous tic she had observed before. He looked up as she approached, his throat bobbing in an anxious swallow. "A strange morning, Miss Whitmore," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Inspector Graves has been asking about the ladies last evening here, the company she kept." Eleanor merely inclined her head, taking in the subtle details, the way the ledger had been left slightly open, as though someone had flipped through it hurriedly, the smudged ink where a name had perhaps been altered, the faint trace of mud leading from the entrance to the stairs. She turned her gaze toward the side table near the window, where a small silver tray still held the remnants of last night's tea service. 3 cups, but only 2 had been used. The third, untouched, bore the same faint aroma she had caught in Lady Margaret's chamber earlier, bitter almonds. "And the matter of Colonel Henshaw's revolver?" she inquired smoothly, her voice even, but her words carried weight. Hargrove paled slightly. "Only 2 bullets missing, but the Colonel swears he never fired them." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. Lies, half-truths, tangled stories. She had expected as much. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured, reaching for the small velvet-lined box beside the tray. Inside, nestled among silk, was a locket, Lady Margaret's most treasured possession, and yet someone had left it here, abandoned like an afterthought. Eleanor ran her fingers lightly over the clasp before turning back toward the growing whispers in the lobby. "People make mistakes when they rush, Mr. Hargrove," she mused. they forget things they never intended to. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor had no doubt, somewhere in this very inn, the murderer was waiting, watching, hoping their secret would remain buried. But secrets, like bodies, had a way of surfacing, and Eleanor had never failed to dig up the truth. The ancient walls of Heritage Inn bore witness to countless stories over the years, but none as chilling as the one unfolding that night, the kind of night where even the wind carried whispers of untold secrets. Far from the bustling city, this village thrived on its silences, the kind that pressed against the skin like a warning, the kind that hinted at something unseen lurking just beneath the surface. Lady Eleanor Blackwood, a woman known for guarding her fortune as fiercely as she guarded her secrets, was found slumped in her favorite velvet chair in the library, the dim glow of a half-melted candle casting eerie, flickering shadows across the bookshelves, as if the very room was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. A single half-empty glass of wine rested near her lifeless hand, and beside it, a leather-bound diary, its pages filled with scrawled frantic handwriting, lay open to an ominous passage. If the will is changed, only one name will remain, and the rest will turn to dust. Inspector Graves took in the scene with a practiced eye, the sharp scent of aged paper, and burning wax mixing with something else, something darker, a question that hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Was this death natural, or had someone ensured that Lady Eleanor would never live to sign her new will? The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their glances darting toward the looming estate that housed more than just old memories. Inside the dimly lit corridors of the inn, the weight of the past was palpable, and as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the tension tightened like a noose around the necks of those who knew more than they dared to say. Mr. Hargreaves, the innkeeper, whose hands trembled as he poured drinks that evening, had been acting strangely since the body was discovered. Was it guilt, or simply the unease of a man who knew too much? And then there was Eleanor's niece Margaret, the one who had spoken of her aunt's unease in recent weeks, yet had suspiciously little to say now that the will had been found with her name conspicuously missing. Every clue, every unspoken word, every nervous glance was another piece of a puzzle that had been carefully orchestrated long before Eleanor took her last breath, and it was then, just as the fire in the hearth crackled, that Graves noticed something peculiar, a silver locket wedged between the floorboards near the fireplace, its chain broken, its surface tarnished with age, and when he pried it open, the discovery sent a chill up his spine. Inside was a half-burned letter, its words barely legible, but enough to send a clear message. The truth once written can only be hidden by fire, but never erased completely. The implications were damning, for someone had tried to destroy this message, someone had feared its contents enough to ensure it never saw the light of day, and yet, like all secrets buried in haste, this one had clawed its way back to the surface. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, as if the very house itself knew that the night was far from over. Inspector Graves did not believe in coincidences, and in a place like this, where history was thick with deception and ambition was a blade sharper than any dagger, he knew that the real story was only just beginning. The fire in the grand hearth crackled softly, its embers pulsing like a dying heartbeat, as the scent of smoldering parchment tainted the air with something old and unsaid. Mrs. Harrow stood rigid, her face drained of color, turning sharply as if startled, her trembling fingers gripping the poker too tightly, the metal still warm from whatever she had been doing with it. In the dim glow of the firelight, her shadow stretched unnaturally across the stone wall, flickering like a guilty whisper struggling to remain unheard. "Mrs. Harrow," came the measured voice of Miss Adair, her presence a stark contrast to the tension in the room, her calm gaze slicing through the dim-lit unease with unsettling precision. Mrs. Harrow forced a tight smile, her fingers twitching as if to conceal the remnants of whatever had been fed to the flames. But the smell lingered, a distinct, acrid scent, something more than just wood or paper, something that had been meant to disappear forever. "Ah, Miss Adair," she murmured, her voice carefully composed yet brittle at the edges, "just clearing out some old memories, letters, keepsakes of no consequence." But the flicker in her gaze betrayed the casual air she so desperately clung to, her eyes darting to the fire, where the last remnants of ink-stained paper curled and blackened into oblivion. Miss Adair stepped forward, her delicate frame moving with the effortless grace of someone who saw far more than she let on, her fingers idly adjusting the fine wool of her shawl as she cast a glance toward the embers. There, half buried beneath the charred remnants, was a corner of parchment that had not yet surrendered to the flames, a fragment of inked words that refused to be silenced. With the faintest tilt of her head, Miss Adair mused, her voice laced with something unreadable. "Memories, yes, but it seems to me that not all memories are meant to be discarded so urgently." Mrs. Harrow stiffened, her grip tightening on the poker, the firelight flickering against the thin sheen of sweat at her temple. "Some things are best forgotten, Miss Adair." A beat of silence stretched between them, thick as the smoke curling toward the rafters, before Miss Adair offered a small, unreadable smile. "Yes, I imagine that's what she would have wanted too. Lady Hawthorne, I mean." At the mention of the late Lady Hawthorne, the reaction was swift, a flinch barely perceptible, but enough for Miss Adair to catch, a ripple of something that should not have been there. Mrs. Harrow swallowed, forcing a chuckle that did little to mask the sudden shift in her composure. Lady Hawthorne was a woman of many thoughts, most of them best left in the past, but Miss Adair was already a step ahead, her eyes catching the faintest shimmer in the half-light, a glint of silver wedged between the stones near the hearth. She moved with quiet deliberation, kneeling just enough to retrieve the object, her fingers brushing against something cold and delicate. A locket, its chain snapped, its surface dulled with time, but when it opened with the faintest click, the secret it held had not been completely lost to time. Inside, tucked beneath the fragile glass, was a fragment of a letter, the ink faded, but still legible enough to deliver its chilling truth. "If she signs the will, she will never see morning." The weight of the words pressed against the air, unseen but suffocating, and as Miss Adair lifted her gaze, she caught the unmistakable flicker of fear in Mrs. Harrow's eyes, an unspoken confession wrapped in silence, the kind that was more damning than words ever could be. The fire crackled, its glow casting shifting shadows across the stone walls, and in that moment the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The night was cold, with only the faint murmur of the wind, and the occasional creak of the mahogany furniture breaking the silence. In the dimly lit drawing room, Miss Eleanor Hargrove sat in the corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, their soft sound barely noticeable over the steady crackling of the fire. The warm glow of the flames flickered across her composed face, but her keen eyes were fixed elsewhere on Mrs. Langley, whose trembling hands clutched a bundle of old yellowed papers, as if they held secrets too dangerous to be seen. The moment Miss Hargrove leaned slightly forward, a familiar scent reached her burning ink, the unmistakable trace of words being erased forever. Langley's fingers twitched as she hastily thrust another paper into the fire, her face momentarily drained of color, as though she had been caught in an act far more incriminating than simply disposing of old letters. Miss Hargrove's voice, gentle yet laced with a subtle sharpness, cut through the air. "Curious, isn't it? Most people preserve their memories, not destroy them, unless of course there is something worth hiding." Mrs. Langley stiffened, her grip tightening on the fireplace poker, her knuckles whitening under the strain. "They're just old letters from my late husband," she said quickly, her voice carefully even, yet it carried the brittle edge of forced composure. "Nothing important." Miss Hargrove tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "And is it only his memories that are turning to ash tonight?" A flicker of something, guilt, fear, or perhaps both, passed through Mrs. Langley's gaze before she could suppress it. But she recovered quickly, smoothing down the front of her dress, her lips curling into an unconvincing smile. "One cannot keep everything, Miss Hargrove. Some things serve no purpose in being held on to." Miss Hargrove nodded absently, though her mind was already working, weaving the strands of unease into something far more intricate. "I suppose," she mused softly, her eyes lingering on the last embers curling into nothingness in the hearth. "But I do wonder, if those letters had been as unimportant as you claim, why would Lady Rosamond have taken such an interest in them?" The mention of Lady Rosamond made Mrs. Langley's breath hitch ever so slightly, a minute reaction that would have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. Yet Miss Hargrove saw it. The flicker of hesitation, the way her fingers stiffened against the poker, as if gripping onto something, perhaps a truth she dared not reveal. When Mrs. Langley finally met Miss Hargrove's gaze, her expression was carefully schooled, but the moment of weakness had already betrayed her. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Lady Rosamond, she had no reason to." Miss Hargrove simply offered a knowing smile, letting the silence stretch, as if giving Mrs. Langley a chance to fill it with the truth. But when no such confession came, she merely inclined her head in polite farewell, and turned toward the door. As she stepped out of the drawing room, she noticed the innkeeper, Mr. Godfrey, busily dusting an already spotless shelf, his movements brisk yet oddly calculated. He had been listening, she realized, watching. "Mrs. Langley has seemed rather unsettled lately," she remarked casually, as if indulging in idle conversation. Mr. Godfrey's hand hesitated for just a fraction of a second before resuming its task. "She's not been feeling well," he answered, too quickly, too simply. Miss Hargrove offered a thoughtful nod. "Or perhaps there is something else that keeps her from sleeping peacefully." The innkeeper finally looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition. He knew exactly what she was implying. Instead of responding, he merely cleared his throat and busied himself elsewhere. Miss Hargrove stepped into the hallway, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders as a slow, knowing smile crept onto her lips. The air in the inn was thick with secrets, each thread of deception woven tightly into its very walls. Mrs. Langley was not the only one harboring something dangerous, and if Miss Hargrove had learned anything over the years, it was that secrets had a way of unraveling piece by piece until the truth lay bare for all to see. Tonight she would let them believe they still had control, but soon the truth would come to light. And in places like this, truth was never as simple as it seemed. A cold wind whispered through the narrow halls of Fairhaven Manor, stirring the heavy drapes that framed the windows like silent sentinels. Miss Eleanor Hawthorne, known for her quiet resilience and an uncanny ability to unravel the most tangled of truths, sat comfortably in the grand drawing room, her fingers idly working at her embroidery, while her keen eyes absorbed the tension that thickened the air. Across from her Mr. Percival Langston stood rigidly by the unlit fireplace, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, the flickering candlelight casting jagged shadows across his gaunt face. He had been a man of control, a master of his own fate, until of course fate had turned against him. "Tell me, Mr. Langston," Eleanor's voice was as soft as the rustling leaves beyond the stained glass window, "when was the last time you saw Lady Beatrice alive?" Langston exhaled sharply, barely masking his irritation. "I've already told Inspector Wren everything I know." "Of course," she murmured, continuing her delicate stitching, "but it's always the smallest details that slip the mind, don't you think? The tiniest things that unravel the grandest illusions." His lips pressed into a thin line. It was just before midnight. She retired to her chambers after taking her tea, as she always did. Eleanor paused for the briefest moment. A predictable routine then, yes, predictable enough for someone to plan around. A flicker of something, fear perhaps, danced in Langston's eyes before he quickly looked away. Eleanor did not press further. Instead she allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle. In silence people often revealed more than they ever would with words. From the corner of her vision, she caught the slight tremble in his fingers, the way his thumb brushed against the sleeve of his coat, nervous, fidgeting, calculating. It was a pattern she had seen before. "You must be mistaken," he said finally, forcing a dry chuckle. "Beatrice had no enemies." Eleanor smiled then, but it did not reach her eyes. "You misunderstand me, Mr. Langston. A person need not have enemies to be in danger. They need only stand in the way of someone else's desires." The embers in the hearth, long extinguished, seemed to smolder in the depths of his gaze. Before she could press further, the door creaked open, and Miss Audrey Finch entered, her face ghostly pale, her hands clutching a folded piece of paper so tightly that her knuckles shone white. "Miss Hawthorne," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I found something." Eleanor rose gracefully, setting her embroidery aside as she took the trembling note from Audrey's grip. Unfolding it carefully, her eyes scanned the delicate script. A single line, written in Lady Beatrice's own hand. "If anything happens to me, the truth lies within the midnight tea." A slow, knowing smile touched Eleanor's lips as she carefully refolded the note. The pieces were falling into place. Miss Eleanor Hawthorne's mind moved swiftly, her sharp gaze fixated on the overturned inkwell near the writing desk. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked, yet its placement was deliberate, too conspicuous to be an accident, too insignificant to be the work of an amateur. The faint scent of almonds still lingered in the air, mingling with the damp, heavy stillness of the room. Poison, a whisper of cyanide. She lifted the small vial with delicate fingers, tilting it slightly under the dim glow of the oil lamp. "Inspector Hargrove," she murmured, her voice calm yet unwavering, "this confirms our suspicions." The inspector, a broad-shouldered man with stormy eyes, leaned in, his expression darkening as he recognized the implications. "Cyanide," he muttered, exhaling sharply. "Which means someone wanted Lady Cresswell's death to seem almost inevitable." Across the room, Miss Audrey Finch stood trembling, her hands clutched together so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "I didn't do this," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I never touched that vial." The inspector turned to her with a measured look, his arms crossing. "Then how did it end up in your case?" he asked, his tone edged with quiet scrutiny. "Your traveling trunk was locked. You're the only one with the key." Audrey shook her head, her dark eyes darting from the inspector to Miss Hawthorne, searching for an escape. "I swear, someone put it there to frame me. You have to believe me." But belief was a luxury neither Hargrove nor Eleanor afforded freely. Instead, Miss Hawthorne's attention shifted to the unlit fireplace, where a scattering of half-burned parchment lay amid the ashes. Carefully, she bent down, retrieving a singed piece between gloved fingers. The ink had blurred, but not entirely. A name remained: Colonel Victor Langley. A quiet realization settled over her. "Inspector," she said softly, "perhaps we're asking the wrong question. It's not about how the poison got into her case. It's about who knew it would be found there." The inspector's frown deepened. "You mean, a diversion?" Miss Hawthorne's voice was deliberate, her words slicing through the tension like a blade. "Who stands to gain the most from Lady Cresswell's death? Colonel Langley has always maintained he was her trusted friend, yet she was preparing to change her will. A convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Audrey gasped, shaking her head. "But Colonel Langley, he was the one who—" She faltered, her hands fell to her sides as the pieces began to fit together in her mind. "He was the one who insisted on fetching the evening tea," Eleanor continued. "The one who had access to the study when Lady Cresswell signed the new documents. The one who ensured we all believed you were the only one who could have placed that vial." The inspector swore under his breath. "So he orchestrated it," he said darkly. "Used Miss Finch as a scapegoat." The wind outside rattled the window panes as if whispering the truth they were only beginning to grasp. Miss Hawthorne straightened, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she murmured, "but there's still one question unanswered." The inspector raised a brow. "And that is?" Eleanor glanced toward the flickering candle, its flame dancing in the oppressive stillness. "Why did he hesitate?" she mused. "If he planned this so meticulously, why leave behind loose ends?" The silence that followed was almost deafening. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the inn, footsteps retreated into the night, and with them the lingering question of whether the true killer had just slipped away, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. Thick fog curled around the dimly lit streets of Blackwood Hollow, swallowing sound and distorting the familiar shapes of cottages and winding lanes. The village, usually humming with the quiet bustle of its inhabitants, had an eerie stillness to it, a silence that did not feel empty, but rather as if something unseen was watching, waiting. Inside the Gallows Inn, the air was thick with tension. The fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the small parlor where the scent of damp wood and stale ale mingled. Inspector Hawthorne stood near the window, his sharp eyes darting between the faces in the room, his fingers drumming impatiently against the sill. He had seen many cases in his career, but something about this one unsettled him. Across the room, Eleanor Finch, the quiet silver-haired woman known for her keen mind, sat with a calm expression, her hands deftly working a pair of knitting needles, though it was clear her focus was elsewhere. She had been observing, analyzing, letting the pieces of the mystery align in her mind. "The tea," she murmured. Finally, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it sliced through the silence like a blade. "It was poisoned, wasn't it?" Hawthorne exhaled sharply, pulling a small slip of paper from his pocket. "The chemist's report." "Arsenic," he confirmed, his voice taut. "Laced into Miss Weatherby's final cup." A gasp rippled through the gathered group, though one figure remained eerily still, Catherine Lowell, the innkeeper's niece, who had been the last to see Miss Weatherby alive. Her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles bone white. "I only brought her the tray," she stammered, eyes darting from Hawthorne to Eleanor, as if searching for an escape. "I swear the tea was fresh when I carried it upstairs." "But was it untouched?" Eleanor's question was gentle, yet Catherine flinched as if struck. "Think carefully, my dear. You placed the tray outside the door. How long before she drank it?" Catherine's mouth opened and closed, a flicker of panic flashing across her face. "I don't know, perhaps 5-10 minutes. She was writing letters, she always did before bed. I knocked, but she asked me to leave it outside." Hawthorne's jaw tightened, which means anyone could have slipped something into the cup before she took her first sip. His gaze swept the room, settling on a single figure standing just out of the firelight's reach. Mr. Alistair Crane, a man whose presence always felt just a little too rehearsed. He had been a dear friend of Miss Weatherby's, yet there was something about his grief that seemed controlled. "You were seen outside her room," Eleanor noted, her eyes never leaving him. Crane's brow furrowed. "I was merely checking on her. She had seemed rather troubled at supper. And well, I thought that you'd see whether she had changed her mind about rewriting her will." Hawthorne's voice was steel. The room froze. A log in the hearth cracked, sending a spray of embers onto the stone floor. Crane inhaled sharply, his gaze darkening. "That's a cruel accusation, Inspector." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her needles momentarily still. "And yet," she said softly, "it explains why she died just hours before she could sign the new document." Crane's face paled. "That's absurd. I bet." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "Miss Weatherby trusted you, Mr. Crane, but trust is a dangerous thing in the wrong hands." She looked toward Hawthorne, her expression unreadable. "And I suspect we are very close to finding just how deep that betrayal goes." The inn felt smaller, suffocating, as the weight of the accusation settled upon the room. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, obscuring everything beyond. But inside, The truth was beginning to take shape, dark, twisted, and far deadlier than anyone had imagined. The damp hush of Ravenswood Inn clung to the air like an unspoken secret, the heavy mist outside pressing against the windows as if trying to listen in. The fire in the hearth crackled low, throwing shadows that seemed to shift and whisper across the walls. Eleanor Whitmore sat with her hands folded neatly over her lap, her sharp eyes fixed on the flickering embers, though her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fractured puzzle that had begun forming the moment Miss Calloway had slumped forward in her chair, her teacup slipping from her fingers. The chemist's report had confirmed what Eleanor already suspected: arsenic, slow and deliberate, woven into the fabric of the evening like a careful stitch in a tapestry. Across the room, Inspector Braithwaite stood with arms crossed, the weight of the case pressing into his shoulders. The tea was untouched when it was brought up, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Miss Calloway poured it herself. No one entered her room after the tray was delivered. Except, Eleanor said, her voice calm but with an edge of certainty, whoever made sure the poison was already waiting for her. The inspector's jaw tightened, and his gaze flicked toward the quiet figure standing in the far corner, Margaret Hale, the housekeeper, her hands gripping the folds of her apron, her face pale. "I don't know how it happened," Margaret whispered, barely more than a breath. The tea was prepared fresh, as always, but Miss Calloway had a habit, you see. She always set her cup down and let it steep for a moment before drinking. It gave someone time. Eleanor studied her, the tiny tremor in her fingers, the hesitation in her voice. "And you were in the kitchen, weren't you? The night it happened?" "Yes," Margaret nodded quickly. "I saw Miss Reynolds there too, rushing about. She didn't speak much that evening, but she seemed flustered, like something was wrong." Eleanor's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, her mind tracing the outline of a plan that had been careful, meticulous even, but with just enough frayed edges to unravel under scrutiny. "Miss Reynolds went upstairs that night, didn't she?" Eleanor prompted, her eyes flicking to the inspector. "Yes," Braithwaite said, his voice hard. "She had business with Miss Calloway, or so she claimed. She was seen leaving the room shortly before the tea was poured." Margaret shifted, her fingers twisting into knots. "There's something else," she admitted, her voice unsteady. "Earlier that evening, a hamper arrived." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "A hamper?" "Yes, from Mr. Graham," Margaret continued. "He's been sending Miss Calloway gifts for weeks. Fine chocolates, imported tea, things she loved." The inspector exhaled sharply, realization dawning. And if someone knew about her routine, knew she would take her tea precisely at 10, Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, then they would know exactly how to time it. The fire crackled again, throwing sharp glimmers of light across the faces in the room. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping the inn in its cold embrace. But inside, the truth was beginning to take form, creeping through the cracks of silence and deceit, ready to emerge at last. The storm outside raged like a beast unchained, its howling winds rattling the old panes of Blackwood Manor, as if desperate to slip inside and whisper its secrets. Inside, however, the true storm was far quieter, far deadlier. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the dimly lit study, her gaze fixed on the man before her, Inspector Braithwaite, his sharp eyes dissecting every flicker of expression on her face. The fire crackled between them, its shifting glow casting restless shadows on the oak-paneled walls, but the real battle was happening in the unspoken weight of the silence. "You were in the drawing-room, weren't you, Miss Whitmore?" His voice was steady, probing, and Eleanor, calm, composed, lethal in her poise, merely tilted her head. "I was," she admitted, her fingers trailing along the edge of the decanter on the side table. "And yet, you claim to know nothing about the poisoned brandy." The inspector leaned forward, his presence thick with accusation. Eleanor let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. "It's a rather bold assumption, Inspector, to think that knowledge and involvement are the same thing." The words dripped from her lips like honey laced with venom. Across the room, Margaret Hale, The young maid clutched her apron with trembling fingers, her wide eyes darting between the two figures, as if she had been caught in a web she never intended to step into. The night before, Lord Ashford had collapsed in this very room, his drink spilled across the Persian rug, his final breath barely more than a whisper. No struggle, no sign of intrusion, only the bitter taste of almonds lingering in the air. Eleanor had known it would come to this, the moment the will was announced, the moment his sudden decision to change everything had been whispered through the estate halls, his fate had been sealed. But poison was a coward's tool, wasn't it? And Eleanor Whitmore was no coward. The brandy decanter was untouched when I left the room, she continued, her tone carrying the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the truth so well that even she might believe it. But you were the last to see him alive, Braithwaite countered, his voice a blade honed to precision, and there it was, the shift, the first crack in the perfectly constructed facade. I wasn't alone, she said, her eyes flickering ever so slightly toward Margaret. The inspector caught it, his gaze snapping to the trembling maid. Miss Hale, he said, his voice softer now, drawing her in. You were there as well, weren't you? The girl swallowed, her throat bobbing painfully. I only brought the tea, she whispered. And yet, Braithwaite pressed, the brandy was already poured. A pause, a second too long. Eleanor's gaze sharpened, the weight of inevitability settling over the room. The tea, she murmured, her voice laced with something unreadable. Of course, the pieces snapped into place with ruthless clarity. It had never been about the brandy at all. The brandy had been a distraction, an elegant misdirection. The poison had been in the tea. Margaret's hands clenched tighter around her apron. I didn't know, she choked out, her voice barely more than a breath. I swear, Miss Whitmore, I didn't know. Eleanor rose from her chair in a slow, deliberate motion, her shadow stretching long and dark across the rug. But someone did, she said, her voice cold enough to still the room. Someone who knew precisely when Lord Ashford took his tea. Someone who knew the routine inside out. Someone who knew that I would be the last person in the room, and that when the moment came, the blame would fall squarely on my shoulders. The inspector's eyes never left her. And who, Miss Whitmore, do you believe that someone is? The fire crackled, the storm howled, and Eleanor Whitmore, elegant, poised, dangerously composed, allowed the smallest of smiles to grace her lips. Why, Inspector, she murmured, that is the question, isn't it? Inspector Harrington's sharp gaze swept across the dimly lit drawing room, the heavy tick of the grandfather clock marking each passing second like a drumbeat of inevitability. The air was thick with tension, and every figure in the room sat unnaturally still, waiting for the storm they all knew was about to break. Lady Evelyn's gloved hands twitched in her lap, her once impeccable composure unraveling at the edges. Across from her Mr. Radcliffe, his lips pursed into a thin line, stared fixedly at the rug, as if the pattern might offer him some escape. But the true spectacle was Miss Lorraine, a woman who had spent her life dancing on the edge of secrets, her porcelain face unreadable, her delicate fingers intertwined, though her knuckles were white with pressure. Harrington, standing by the fireplace, let the silence stretch, watching the way the flickering light from the flames played across their features, revealing more in the way they avoided each other's eyes than any confession ever could. Then at last he spoke, his voice measured but edged with steel. It all comes down to timing, he murmured, letting his words settle like a weight upon the room. The moment Lady Evelyn's medicine was swapped, the instant the vial disappeared, the precise second the key to the study was taken, each moment calculated, each piece shifting perfectly into place. But accidents don't happen so perfectly, do they? No one answered, but Lorraine's fingers twitched. The vial was missing long before anyone noticed, and yet someone here knew exactly when the fatal dose had been slipped into Lady Evelyn's cordial. Someone knew when her routine would leave her most vulnerable, when the house would be at its quietest, when she would be alone, and that someone had been watching, his gaze locked onto Miss Lorraine. You were the last person in the study that night. You hesitated before calling for help, long enough to ensure she was beyond saving. Why? Lorraine swallowed, but still, she did not speak. Because you didn't act alone, Harrington continued, stepping forward, his words soft but relentless. You had help, someone who had as much to gain from Lady Evelyn's demise as you did. Someone who ensured the study key was misplaced at just the right moment. Someone who made certain the safe was left unlocked the very morning before her death. But the truth is, Miss Lorraine, you were never meant to be the mastermind, were you? Just the pawn. The room, already thick with silence, seemed to tighten around them. Lorraine's breath hitched, the first crack in the mask. She had always been careful, always composed, but there were some truths too heavy to carry alone. And as the night deepened, the weight of it all came crashing down. Inspector Hawthorne's boots clicked sharply against the polished oak floor as the gathered guests sat stiffly in the drawing-room, the air thick with unsaid words and concealed truths. At the heart of it all, Miss Evelyn Blackthorne sat in her high-backed chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, the rhythm methodical yet unnerving. Outside, the storm raged on, rain slashing against the windows, a fitting backdrop for the storm about to break within these walls. "We've waited long enough," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "It's time we put the pieces together." Her keen eyes flickered from face to face, lingering for just a fraction too long, as if peeling back the layers of deception each person wore so carefully. Lord Whittaker, whose fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair with barely concealed impatience. Miss Audrey Sinclair, the young companion, her face pale and pinched, hands clutching her skirts just a little too tightly. And then, of course, there was Mr. Carraway, the ever-quiet solicitor, who had barely spoken since the body was found. It had all started with a single cup of chamomile tea. Lady Constance Ashford, once a formidable force in society, had taken her final sip and collapsed within minutes, the scent of almonds lingering faintly in the air. Cyanide. A classic choice but effective nonetheless. "We know the poison was introduced that evening," Evelyn continued, her voice weaving through the tension. "But how, and more importantly, by whom?" A sharp intake of breath from Miss Audrey, a subtle shift in Mr. Carraway's posture, small, nearly imperceptible cracks forming. The tea set was untouched after it was served, meaning the poison had to be added beforehand, she continued, her knitting never ceasing. And the only person who had both the means and opportunity was someone with knowledge of Lady Ashford's nightly habits. Her eyes locked onto Miss Audrey, whose lip quivered. "You prepared the tea that night, didn't you?" "I only followed her instructions," Miss Audrey stammered, voice trembling. She was particular about how it was made. "Ah, yes. Which is precisely why she always took her cup from the left side of the tray, the same cup where the poison was placed." A flicker of movement, Lord Whittaker shifted uneasily, his eyes darting towards the darkened window. "But Miss Audrey didn't act alone," Evelyn continued, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Someone guided her, manipulated her." She turned her attention now to Mr. Carraway, whose impassive mask finally cracked, his jaw tightening. "It was you, wasn't it?" A beat of silence, the fire crackled, the storm howled, and then a chuckle. "You're clever, Miss Blackthorne," Carraway murmured, his lips curling into something that might have been admiration. "But tell me, what proof do you have?" Evelyn's smile was small, knowing. "You overlooked one thing. The will." The room went still. Lady Ashford had intended to change her will, cutting certain beneficiaries out entirely, but you knew that, didn't you, Mr. Carraway? You were the one handling the legal paperwork. His expression darkened, the realization setting in that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. You knew that once she signed the documents, you and your accomplice would lose everything, so you acted swiftly. A slow exhale. Then Miss Audrey let out a sob, burying her face in her hands. "He told me it wouldn't kill her," she whispered. "Just make her ill. Enough for a delay. But it had been enough. Enough to take a life. Enough to unravel the fragile threads of deception." Inspector Hawthorne took a step forward, his voice firm. "Miss Audrey Sinclair, Mr. James Carraway, you are both under arrest for the murder of Lady Constance Ashford." The weight of the moment settled over them all. As Miss Audrey was led away, Carraway remained still, his gaze meeting Evelyn's for a long unreadable moment before he too was taken. The storm outside began to ease, as if the very house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the truth to be spoken. Evelyn resumed her knitting, her hands steady, another puzzle solved, another secret laid bare. The world, it seemed, would keep turning, but she would always be watching, always listening. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Blackwood Hollow, carrying with it the whispers of secrets long buried. A week had passed since the death of Lady Eleanor Whitmore, and though the village had resumed its mundane rhythm, an unshakable shadow still lingered. The once vibrant town square now felt muted, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for some unseen force to stir it once more. In the dimly lit drawing room of the Whitmore estate, Miss Evelyn Blackthorne sat with quiet composure, her fingers tracing the rim of her delicate porcelain teacup. Across from her, Inspector Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, his keen eyes studying the fire, as if its flickering flames held the final answer to the puzzle they had unraveled. "You were right, of course," he murmured, breaking the silence. "Fear and desperation, they make for dangerous companions." Evelyn smiled faintly, setting down her cup with meticulous care. "Desperation is a cruel master, Inspector. It makes even the gentlest souls capable of the most unthinkable acts." Outside, the rain pattered softly against the window panes, the storm from days before having left behind a persistent chill. Lord Whittaker, once a towering figure in the village, now walked with a stooped posture, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. Mr. Carraway, ever the quiet observer, had disappeared from public eye, his involvement in the scandal not enough to convict him, yet enough to render him a pariah. But it was Miss Audrey Montgomery who bore the heaviest burden. She had confessed, her trembling voice cracking under the weight of truth, but was she the true orchestrator, or merely a pawn in someone else's game? The villagers had accepted her guilt, eager for closure, but Evelyn knew better. The pieces fit too neatly, the confession too convenient. The scent of lavender still lingered in Lady Eleanor's chamber, masking something more sinister, the faint, almost imperceptible trace of arsenic hidden in the lining of her favorite book. A method too subtle for Miss Audrey, but not for someone with patience, someone who knew how to wait. Evelyn exhaled, her gaze shifting back to the fire. "And so the world turns," she said softly, more to herself than to Hawthorne. "The village forgets, life continues, and the past settles into the quiet corners of memory." The inspector studied her for a moment before nodding. "But you won't forget." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "No," she admitted, "I never do." The rain had ceased now, leaving behind the scent of damp earth, and the distant echo of thunder rolling beyond the hills. Blackwood Hollow had found its peace once more, but Evelyn knew that peace was often just another illusion. Somewhere, buried beneath polite smiles and lowered gazes, another secret waited to be uncovered. And when the time came, she would be watching. Always,